They fined me for saving lives. $300 because my fire truck was supposedly too big for the neighborhood. According to the HOA president, I was somehow damaging property values. Imagine that. Tammy, a firefighter, labeled a threat. But she made a critical mistake. She forgot that firefighters know better than anyone what makes things burn. And when my crew and I set out to give the community a fire safety demonstration, a broken bar, let's just say her illegal fence, turned into the perfect hands-on lesson. Some lessons come from books, others you learn watching your own violations go up in smoke. Welcome to Echo Stories, where revenge writes itself. You won't believe where this goes. My name's Dylan Riley, but everyone at the station calls me Phoenix. Not because I rise from ashes, though that's about to be fitting, but because I never stay down for long. 15 years fighting fires, saving lives, and serving the people around me. I live in Maplewood Heights, a suburb where the lawns are always pristine and the HOA rules are absurdly strict. For 2 years straight, my red Ford F-350 sat in the same spot on Elm Street. But this wasn't just any pickup, it was my pride and joy. A converted emergency response vehicle, polished to a shine, loaded with rescue gear, and sporting a license plate that proudly read Volunteer Fire. Kids loved it. After school, they'd rush over asking if they could honk the horn or sit in the driver's seat. Parents liked having it there, too. It made everyone feel just a bit safer. Mrs. Smith from a few houses down once told me, "Dylan, knowing you and that trucker here helps us sleep easier." That truck had become part of the neighborhood's identity. Tourists could have used it as a landmark. A turn left at the big red fire truck, but apparently, Rebecca Morrison had other ideas. Rebecca Morrison. Even her name sounds like trouble. She was in her early 50s, hair so tightly pulled back it could slice glass, and glasses she wore like a weapon. Not just any HOA president, she was a former lawyer, fired from her firm for the most ridiculous reason you can imagine. She once sued the fire department for property damage, a broken bar, after we broke down her door to save her neighbor during a heart attack. Yes, a lawyer suing firefighters for doing their job. She lost the case, humiliated herself, and got booted from her firm. Ever since, she seemed determined to punish anyone wearing a uniform. One morning, an envelope showed up on my doorstep, thick, formal, with the HOA seal so deeply pressed it looked like medieval branding. Inside, a $300 fine. The violation? Commercial vehicle parked in residential area over 24 hours, citing Regulation B73. But that wasn't the worst part. Attached were 47 photographs. I counted. She'd conducted a full-scale investigation, shots from every angle, measuring tape and frame, timestamps, GPS data, the kind of evidence you'd expect if my truck had been part of a crime syndicate. My blood boiled as I flipped through them. There was my truck, documented like a suspect. She'd measured every dimension, noted the license plate, the emergency lights, even the dent on the bumper. I'd gotten rescuing a family from a wreck last year. This wasn't about following the rules, it was personal. So, I did the reasonable thing and called her. "Miss Morrison," I began, trying to sound calm, "I got your notice about my fire truck. I think there's been a misunderstanding. It's not a commercial vehicle, it's for emergency response." Her answer was cold as ice. "Mr. Riley, rules are rules. I don't care how many cats you've rescued or parades you've driven in. That oversized vehicle is a violation, and it needs to go." Then she hung up. A firefighter trying to keep the community safe, and she hung up on me. But giving up isn't in my nature. They call me Phoenix for a reason. The next day, I pulled together every piece of documentation I could find: my fire department certification, emergency vehicle permits, insurance papers, photos of community events where my truck was featured. I even included a crayon drawing little Susie Thompson made after I helped save her family's house, a picture of my truck with "Hero" scrawled in purple letters. I scanned everything, wrote a polite, well-organized cover letter explaining the truck's purpose and its value to the community, then emailed it all to Rebecca. And then I waited. 3 days passed with no reply. And in my experience, when bureaucrats stay silent, it usually means bad news. With Rebecca Morrison, it almost certainly meant she was planning her next move. Sure enough, an email arrived. Her reply was curt and cutting. "Mr. Riley, Your fine has been raised to $500 for resisting HOA authority and filing frivolous appeals. Payment is due within 5 business days. Further resistance will lead to additional penalties and potential legal action. The rules are clear, and your attempt to sway the board through emotional manipulation is unprofessional. I read it over and over, each time angrier than before. Emotional manipulation? For sharing evidence of my service to the community and photos of kids I'd helped protect? I stepped outside and looked at my truck. Had the same truck that had sat there for 2 years without complaint until Rebecca Morrison decided to start her personal crusade. She picked the wrong person to challenge. As I stood there looking from my fire truck to Rebecca's house across the street, I felt something inside me click into place, like a gear locking in. A slow grin spread across my face. "All right, Rebecca," I murmured to myself. "Let's see how you like this." What Rebecca didn't realize was that she just ignited a game she wasn't prepared to play, and she had no clue how it would end. That night, driven by stubborn determination, I did something I'd never bothered to do before. I read the entire HOA rulebook, every last page. All 127 pages crammed with dense legal jargon, pointless clauses, and power-hungry restrictions disguised as community standards. Sitting at my kitchen table with a pot of coffee and a highlighter, I dissected the rule she'd weaponized against me. And as the hours dragged on, I stumbled on something that made me pause. Rebecca had bumped my fine up to $500, but the bylaws stated that any fine exceeding $200 had to be approved by a neighborhood vote. She'd completely ignored her own cherished regulations. But that wasn't the real jackpot. Hidden halfway through the document, under a section on property maintenance, was Regulation B-127. Wooden structures posing a fire risk near residences are strictly prohibited. Fences had to meet minimum distance requirements and comply with local fire codes. My pulse quickened as I read it again. Then I stepped outside, took a long look across the street at Rebecca's fence and almost burst out laughing. The very woman leading a crusade about safety had a fence that was practically a bonfire waiting to happen. While I stood there processing it all, I noticed my neighbor Trevor Williams tending his garden. Trevor's the quiet type, early 40s, thinning hair, and always looks like he'd apologize to a door for bumping into it. He glanced over with a faint wave and a cautious smile. "Tough break, huh?" he called softly. Word had already spread. I gave a grim nod. "Rebecca seems set on making my life hell," I replied. Trevor looked around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "She isn't exactly reasonable," he warned gently. "Good luck, Dylan." There was something in his tone, a mix of worry and resignation, that told me he'd seen Rebecca's tactics firsthand. The very next morning, Rebecca turned things up a notch. She distributed a neighborhood-wide email newsletter, all dressed up in official HOA branding. The title alone was ridiculous. Important Safety Notice, addressing the Riley situation. Reading it felt surreal. 3 paragraphs dedicated to painting me as a reckless pretender with a flashy truck, insisting it endangered everyone's safety and lowered property values. She even called me a fake firefighter, claiming real first responders didn't need to show off with personal vehicles. It worked, too. People I chatted with every day suddenly avoided me. Mrs. Patterson, who usually stopped to talk while walking her dog, started crossing the street instead. The Henderson family, who used to wave from their porch, now averted their eyes. Even the mail carrier seemed uncomfortable, barely glancing my way. In a matter of days, my standing in the neighborhood turned cold, all because of her smear campaign. But Rebecca had made a tactical mistake. She didn't just fine me, she questioned my character and dedication to protecting people. That was something I couldn't ignore. Determined, I spent my Saturday doing some investigating of my own. Her fence was a perfect example of what not to build. 10 years old, untreated pine boards turned brittle and splintered from the weather. It stood about 2.2 meters tall, well above the 2-meter maximum, and it was only a single meter from her house, breaking the 1.5-meter fire safety rule. The wood was so dry and cracked I could have probably set it ablaze with a spark. Some boards were loose, some warped, and every part of it screamed fire hazard to anyone who knew what to look for. Then I dug through HOA records for the past year and found something that sealed it. 6 months earlier, Rebecca had forced poor Mr. Wilson, an older gentleman living a couple streets over, to tear down his fence because it was 2.1 meters tall and stood 1.2 meters from his house. Practically the same issue, except Rebecca's own fence was worse. Wilson had to spend thousands rebuilding to her exact specifications. Yet her own rotting fence had been standing there, untouched and in violation for years. So, I did what she'd done to me. I documented everything. 47 photos from every angle, showing tape measures, dates, and clear proof of each violation. As I worked, that same cold smile returned to my face. The woman who bullied neighbors and sued firefighters had the biggest fire hazard on the block, and I was ready to reveal it. Trevor watched me from his window at first, then cautiously walked over to where I was photographing the fence line. His expression was tense, like he wanted to stop me but couldn't find the words. "Dylan," he asked quietly, "what exactly are you doing?" I showed him the HOA rules, pointed out every violation, and told him about how she'd made Wilson rebuild his fence for nearly identical reasons. Trevor's eyes widened. "You're really going to report her?" he asked, almost whispering. "She's going to be furious." I just shrugged. "Trevor, she picked this fight when she attacked my reputation and my work for this community. If she wants to play dirty, so can I, by the rules. Then she needed to follow them too." The irony was almost poetic. Rebecca Morrison, a former lawyer, HOA president, and self-proclaimed defender of neighborhood standards, was herself breaking the very rules she'd used to bully everyone else. For months, she terrorized residents with surprise inspections, slapped fines on people for the tiniest infractions, and weaponized regulations like a club. Now, those same rules were about to come crashing down on her perfectly manicured doorstep. I uploaded my photos, cross-referenced them with the HOA handbook, and drafted an official complaint of my own. Two could play the paperwork game. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote an email that would have made my old English teacher proud. Formal, measured, and absolutely devastating. "Dear Miss Morrison, as a fire safety professional and concerned resident, I feel obligated to bring a serious hazard to your attention. While reviewing compliance with HOA regulations, I discovered what appears to be a significant fire risk that could endanger lives and property. Attached you'll find photographic evidence and references to the relevant regulations. Given your commitment to neighborhood safety, I trust you'll address this issue promptly." I hit send right at midnight, picturing Rebecca's face as she read it. The woman who'd called me a fake firefighter was about to learn what real fire safety knowledge looked like, and this time, the threat was in her own backyard. The hunter was about to become the hunted. And I was just getting started. Rebecca's reply came at 6 in the morning, buzzing my phone awake from the first real sleep I'd had in days. Her email dripped with legal jargon and condescension. "Mr. Riley, your attempt to distract from your own violations through baseless accusations is noted. My property is in full compliance. Your intimidation tactics will not be tolerated. Consider this your final warning." That was it. Rebecca hadn't just dismissed me, she'd declared all-out war. By noon, she'd called an emergency HOA meeting for that same evening. The agenda: new restrictions on oversized vehicles and resident compliance. She was going nuclear. The meeting was held in the community center. Fluorescent lights, rows of plastic chairs, and the hum of whispered gossip. Rebecca sat at the head table like a judge in black robes, her assistant nearby with a folder of documents and a recorder. About 30 neighbors showed up, paying more than usual, drawn by the promise of conflict. The tension in the room was thick. Some people wouldn't meet my eye, others gave small nods of sympathy. Everyone seemed to know something big was coming. Rebecca opened the meeting in her practiced, commanding voice. "Tonight, we address a serious threat to neighborhood safety and property values. Mr. Riley's oversized vehicle sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow one resident to ignore our regulations, where does it end?" Then she announced the real bombshell. "Mr. Riley has 7 days to comply or face fines up to $2,000 per day." The room gasped. $2,000 a day? Enough to crush anyone financially in under a week. Rebecca painted me as an ego-driven rule-breaker who thought he was above everyone else. And the worst part was watching some of my neighbors nod along, swallowing her narrative whole. That walk home felt longer than any fire call I'd ever run. Back in my garage, staring at my truck. The truck I'd bought to help people, to respond faster, to save lives. I started questioning everything. Maybe she was right, maybe I really didn't belong here. I opened my laptop and drafted a resignation letter from the HOA. Then I began writing a listing to sell my truck. Every word felt like an obituary. Custom fire response vehicle, fully equipped, selling due to neighborhood restrictions. My lowest moment came when I stepped outside to take down the small firefighter flag by my door, the one I got after my 500th emergency call, a milestone that meant something. Folding it up felt like folding away part of who I was. That's when I heard a small voice. "Hi, fire hero." It was 6-year-old Emma from 3 houses down, waving shyly. Her mother tried to hush her, but Emma kept smiling. "Are you still going to save people?" she asked, with the pure honesty only kids have. Something broke open in my chest. Emma didn't see an oversized truck or an HOA complaint. She saw a firefighter, and that still mattered. I looked down at the flag in my hands, then back at Emma. "Yeah, kiddo," I called back. "I'm still going to save people." Her smile was pure, unconscious, and real. And in that moment, I understood. This fight wasn't really about parking spaces or fines. It was about refusing to let someone else decide who I got to be. Rebecca wanted me to disappear, to turn into just another neighbor too afraid to speak up. But firefighters don't back down. I went inside, deleted the resignation letter, and picked up my phone. "Hey guys," I said, feeling like myself again. "How do you feel about doing some community education? I think our neighborhood could use a fire safety workshop." The enthusiasm on the other end was instant. "Dylan, that's brilliant," said Captain Walsh. "When and where?" I looked out my window, straight at Rebecca's fence in her violation-riddled fortress, and I smiled. By 1828, I was already smiling at the thought of what came next. Looking at Rebecca's violation-riddled fence, I knew exactly where the workshop would be. A few minutes later, Trevor appeared at his window, watching me from behind the glass. After a moment, he stepped outside, wearing that same nervous expression he always had around conflict. "Dylan," he began quietly, "You'll a broken bar different, more determined." I nodded. "Trevor, I almost let her win, almost convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for what's right." He glanced around, lowered his voice, and asked, "What are you going to do?" I showed him the fire safety education permit I'd been preparing and explained the plan for a free community workshop. His eyes widened, equal parts admiration and panic. "She's going to see this as a direct challenge," Trevor warned. "Rebecca doesn't like being challenged." I surprised myself by laughing, the sound lighter than it had felt in days. "Trevor, she challenged me first when she went after my integrity and my service. Now she'll see what happens when you pick a fight with someone whose job is saving lives." As I spoke, I saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of hope, maybe relief. Someone, finally, wasn't backing down. Dylan was about to do something that could change everything. Was it justice, or revenge? Type hero if you think he's right, or villain if you think he's gone too far. Monday morning, I filed all the paperwork with the city for a community fire safety workshop. Everything was legitimate, documented, and completely within regulations, exactly the kind of paperwork Rebecca usually hid behind. 3 of my fellow firefighters volunteered to help. I chose the small public park that bordered Rebecca's backyard. From there, every attendee would have a perfect view of the violations on her fence. The workshop was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, giving me enough time to draft professional community notices formatted just like Rebecca's own HOA bulletins. Captain Walsh, Miller, and Thompson were immediately on board. "About time someone stood up to those HOA tyrants," Walsh said, a grin spreading across his face. "We'll bring the full setup. Let's show them what real public service looks like." By Tuesday, flyers were printed and distributed. Free community fire safety education. Learn to protect your family and property. Rebecca discovered my plan within hours. I was washing my truck when I saw her crossing the street, face red, clipboard clutched like a weapon. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Riley?" she snapped, waving the flyer as if it were proof of criminal intent. I kept washing the truck, deliberately calm. "Community education, Rebecca. Fire safety is important. Surely you agree." Her voice pitched higher, on the edge of shrieking. "This is harassment. You're using your position to intimidate and threaten private citizens." Finally, I looked at her, letting my steady tone highlight her fury. "I'm teaching fire safety, unless you consider education a threat." She spun on her heel and stomped back to her house, immediately organizing her counterattack. By Wednesday, her flyers hit mailboxes. Emergency home meeting, addressing safety concerns about unauthorized activities. She painted the workshop as a reckless stunt by someone with questionable credentials and an obvious personal agenda. The neighborhood split faster than I expected. Families with kids signed up for the workshop right away. The Hendersons, the Smiths, the Millers, and others. But Rebecca's loyalists, mostly older residents obsessed with order, rallied behind her. Mrs. Patterson handed out her own flyers warning about unauthorized emergency demonstrations and potential liability. Friday evening, Rebecca held her emergency meeting. I didn't attend, but Trevor did. Afterward, he found me. "She's terrified, Dylan," Trevor whispered, glancing around like he expected her to pop out of the hedges. "She kept ranting about you using intimidation tactics, but whenever anyone asked about fire safety or her fence violations, she changed the subject." He paused. "I think she knows you've got her cornered." Saturday dawned bright and clear. By noon, families had gathered in the park. Walsh, Miller, and Thompson arrived with the full demonstration setup: controlled burn equipment, smoke detectors, extinguishers, and educational brochures. The kids were fascinated. Parents asked thoughtful questions about home fire safety and evacuation plans. For that first hour, it felt exactly like what I'd envisioned. Neighbors coming together, learning, talking, connecting. Walsh showed everyone how to test smoke alarms. Miller demonstrated proper use of an extinguisher. Thompson explained how to plan a family escape route. The Martinez family brought homemade cookies, still grateful for the day we saved their garage. Mrs. Smith quietly thanked me again for helping during her husband's heart attack. What struck me most was the ripple effect. Neighbors who barely spoke were swapping phone numbers and planning emergency contacts. Children who'd been afraid of sirens were now climbing on the truck, laughing, seeing help instead of fear. Even some of Rebecca's usual supporters hovered at the edge, clearly curious but afraid to join in fully. They kept glancing nervously toward her house, as if worried they'd be caught enjoying something they weren't supposed to. Mrs. Patterson, who distributed Rebecca's flyers, finally stepped closer and asked, almost in a whisper, about smoke detector battery life. And that was the moment I realized, this fight was never really about a truck, a fence, or even the hoe. It was about what kind of community we wanted to be. The questions kept coming. Mrs. Patterson asked quietly about smoke detector batteries. An elderly man from Oak Street raised his hand to ask about carbon monoxide detectors. I could see it in their face as if the fear of Rebecca still weighed on them, keeping them from asking openly. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here we were trying to share knowledge that could save lives, while their so-called leader was likely inside plotting how to stop us. Community safety versus personal power, service versus control. The difference had never been clearer. But Rebecca wasn't about to let me have my moment without a fight. At exactly 1 p.m., she appeared, flanked by her usual supporters. They stationed themselves right between my demonstration area and her fence. Some carried hastily made signs, "Stop the harassment and HO rules matter." "This is what intimidation looks like," she announced, pointing at our equipment. "Mr. Riley is using fear tactics to settle personal grudges." The irony was almost comedic. There stood Rebecca Morrison, who once sued firefighters and now protesting a fire safety workshop, while literally standing next to a fence that violated every fire safety regulation in the book. Walsh leaned over, voice low. "Dylan, a broken bar, is that fence supposed to be that close to the house?" I nodded grimly. 10-year-old pine, over 2 meters tall, barely a meter from the structure. "It's a walking fire hazard." Walsh gave a low whistle. "And she's protesting fire safety education while standing next to kindling." So I decided to make the most of it. Raising my voice so both groups could hear, I said, "Today we're going to talk about fire behavior in residential settings. One of the biggest risks, combustible materials placed too close to structures. Old dry wood can ignite from a single spark and spread faster than most people realize." As I spoke, I gestured to various spots around the park, but my gaze kept drifting pointedly at Rebecca's fence. Proper spacing and fire-resistant materials save lives, I concluded. Rebecca saw what I was doing and snapped, "This is a threat," she shrieked, her voice raw. "He's threatening my property." But the families weren't buying it. They were asking questions, learning, and genuinely engaged. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. A firefighter teaching life-saving skills versus an angry neighbor yelling slogans next to a fence built like a bonfire waiting to happen. Even some of her supporters looked uneasy, suddenly questioning what, exactly, they were protesting. Then, as if the wind itself was siding with education, a breeze picked up, atypical for afternoons here, but perfect for demonstration. "Notice how wind can change fire behavior," I explained, showing how even a small flame could suddenly grow dangerous. "A gentle breeze can turn a controlled burn into something unpredictable in seconds." The families leaned in, fascinated. Kids watched wide-eyed. My colleagues and I showed how wind direction matters, why clearances are required, and what happens when those codes aren't followed. And then it happened. A tiny ember from our completely controlled demonstration, caught by that afternoon breeze, drifted away, landing in exactly the worst place it could. Rebecca's 10-year-old, dried-out fence. In a blink, it ignited. The flames didn't just catch, they raced, fueled by dry pine and close proximity to the house. It became an instant, terrifying lesson in why fire codes exist. "Fire!" Rebecca shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. "Someone call 911. I was already moving toward the emergency equipment. "Calm, professional, ma'am," I said, meeting her wide eyes. "You already did." Walsh, Miller, Thompson, and I reacted exactly as we'd trained for years. Quick, practiced, efficient. Within minutes, we had the blaze under control, stopping it before it could spread to her house or any other structure. When the smoke cleared, the fence was gone, the blackened posts and ashes, but no one was hurt, and nothing else was damaged. Rebecca stood frozen, staring at the ruins. Shock, rage, and something else flickered across her face, maybe the realization that everything I'd warned about had come true. The families who'd come for fire safety education saw it all: the demonstration, the unexpected fire, and the professional response that kept everyone safe. In that moment, they understood why these lessons matter. Trevor appeared beside me, his voice low. "Dylan, a broken bar. Was that a broken bar?" I shook my head. "That was exactly what we've been warning about, Trevor. Old dry wood too close to a structure. It's why those codes exist." Rebecca kept staring, as if trying to process what had just happened. And for the first time, she seemed unsure. Sometimes, I thought, the most powerful lesson isn't taught with words, it's shown by what happens when warnings are ignored. But was this really an accident, or something else? This is Ya Stories, where karma meets consequences. Was it fate, or was it planned? Drop your theory below. The aftermath came quickly. Rebecca stood in the ruins of her fence, pointing an accusing finger at me. "He planned this," she screamed. "He threatened my property and then burned it down." But the families had seen it differently. They'd witnessed a safety demonstration, interrupted by an unfortunate but instructive accident. Exactly the kind of event that shows why fire safety matters. Captain Walsh stepped up beside me, ready to back me up. And the neighborhood? They were starting to see through the fear and see what real service looked like. Captain Walsh approached Rebecca with the calm authority of someone who'd faced countless emergencies. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I need you to step back while we secure the area and complete our documentation for the incident report." Rebecca's protests turned shrill, teetering on the edge of hysteria. "Document this. He's a criminal. This was arson." Walsh barely blinked. "Ma'am, I've been fighting fires for 20 years, he said, his voice steady. "What I see here is the predictable result of placing combustible materials too close to ignition sources. This is exactly why fire codes exist." The neighborhood's reaction split almost instantly, exactly as I'd expected. The families who'd been at the workshop were shaken, but their gratitude was unmistakable. "Thank God you were here, Dylan," Mrs. Henderson told me, squeezing her young son's hand. "If this had happened when no one was around, a broken bar," she trailed off, but the unspoken truth hung heavily in the air. Meanwhile, Rebecca's loyalists clustered around her, convinced they'd witnessed some deliberate act. But then Trevor stepped forward, a quiet, steady, and unexpectedly brave. While Rebecca ranted about conspiracies and sabotage, Trevor quietly showed several neighbors the video he'd filmed. "I started recording from my window when I saw the crowds forming," he explained. "You can see the wind pick up and the ember drift over. It was an accident, a predictable one, yeah, but still an accident." His recording would prove crucial in the days that followed. An emergency home meeting was scheduled for Monday night. Rebecca came armed for battle. Thick folders, printed photos, a prepared speech. She stood before a packed community center and declared, "This was a calculated attack on my property and my authority." Dylan Riley used his position and access to fire department resources to commit arson. "But in her rush to turn the community against me, she'd ignored her own vulnerability and the growing questions about her actions." Wilson, the elderly gentleman she'd forced to rebuild his fence months earlier, rose slowly. "I hate to interrupt," he began softly, "but I'm confused. Rebecca made me tear down my fence because it was too tall and too close to my house. But her fence that just burned a broken bar wasn't it taller and even closer than mine was?" The room fell into a heavy silence. Mrs. Smith raised her hand. "I remember that inspection," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Rebecca insisted Wilson's fence was a safety violation that couldn't wait. She said the regulations were absolute. "So broken bar, why did her fence stay up for 10 years? The questions hung in the air like smoke. Rebecca's face lost its color. Then Trevor stood, holding his phone with an unexpected calm. "I have something to share," he announced, his voice louder than usual. "I've been documenting things in the neighborhood for my own safety. I also have records showing how rules were enforced selectively." He connected his phone to the community center's display. One by one, images and documents appeared. Photos of clear violations ignored because the homeowners were close to Rebecca. Documentation of fines issued without proper votes. Email threads showing Rebecca coordinating with allies to target residents she disliked. Then came the most damning evidence. Financial records Trevor had quietly collected, showing HOA funds used for Rebecca's personal legal battle, including her failed lawsuit against the fire department. "This is bigger than a fence," Trevor continued, finding strength in every word. "This is abuse of power, selective enforcement, using our community association to punish anyone who challenged Rebecca's authority. Dylan isn't the problem, he's just the latest target." The room erupted. Neighbors, some still holding copies of Rebecca's accusations, suddenly realized the truth. Rebecca tried to seize control, her voice sharp and brittle. "This meeting is about Riley's criminal actions, not irrelevant personal attacks." But it was too late. One after another, residents stood to share their own stories. The Millers, fined for their kids' chalk drawings on the driveway. The Johnsons, forced to remove a small memorial garden for their daughter because it didn't match landscaping standards. Story after story painted the same picture: petty punishments, intimidation, and rules twisted into weapons. Then the final blow came from an unexpected place. Mrs. Patterson, one of Rebecca's staunchest allies, rose, her voice shaking. "I need to confess something," she said, tears welling. "Rebecca asked me to take photos of neighbors' yards to look for violations. She told me it was for safety, but now I see it was just to keep files on anyone who might disagree. I'm so sorry." The vote of no confidence was swift, almost brutal. 48 in favor of removing Rebecca, only 4 against. The margin left even her remaining supporters silent. In a single evening, her power collapsed, and not because of a fire, but because the truth finally came out. Rebecca lost everything that night: her HOA presidency, access to community funds, and any power to enforce rules. The residents voted to launch a full investigation into her financial misconduct and passed new measures requiring complete transparency for all future HOA actions. Her exit was as dramatic as her reign had been. She stood at the front of the room, facing neighbors who had once feared her but now rejected her entirely. "You'll regret this," she warned, her voice icy. "Without proper leadership, this community will descend into chaos. You need structure. You need someone willing to enforce standards." But no one was listening anymore. The neighbors had finally seen the difference between leadership and tyranny. As the meeting wrapped up, something remarkable happened. People who'd been too afraid to speak for months began talking openly. sharing their stories, and discussing how to rebuild trust. The neighborhood felt lighter, as though a storm cloud had finally passed. Children played without parents worrying about fines. Families decorated their yards without scanning for violation notices. The community was healing at this time around fairness and mutual respect instead of fear. One by one, neighbors approached me, offering support and quiet apologies. "Dylan," said Mrs. Henderson softly, "I'm sorry we let her make us afraid of you. We should have spoken up sooner." I shook my head. Everyone spoke up when it mattered most. That's what communities do. They protect each other once the real threat becomes clear. As people filed out, Trevor approached, looking drained but somehow taller, more solid. "I never thought I'd have the courage to do something like that," he admitted. "But seeing you stand up to hear a broken bar, it made me realize sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even if it scares you." I clapped him on the shoulder. "Trevor, you didn't just find courage, you saved this community." The video, the records you kept a broken bar, that was the proof we needed. Walking home that night, I paused by my truck, parked exactly where it had been for years, right where it belonged. The community had chosen fairness over fear, service over selfishness, justice over arbitrary power. Rebecca Morrison's reign was over, and at last, the neighborhood could breathe. Rebecca was finished, but she wasn't going quietly. What she did next shocked everyone. Within a week, the transition moved faster than anyone expected. Trevor was elected interim HOA president with a clear mandate to rebuild trust and transparency. His first act was to create a committee system so no single person could hand out fines or make enforcement decisions alone. His second act, officially recognizing my truck as a community safety asset, transforming what Rebecca had treated as an eyesore into a symbol of neighborhood protection. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The very vehicle she tried to ban was now protected by the community she'd tried to control. But Rebecca couldn't accept defeat. Just 3 days after her removal, a certified letter arrived at my door. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from a downtown law firm. Rebecca was suing me personally, accusing me of deliberate property destruction, reckless endangerment, and abuse of professional credentials. She wanted $15,000 in damages, legal fees, and a court order to bar me from doing any fire safety work in the neighborhood. It was a petty, spiteful lawsuit, but still dangerous. Rebecca was betting that even a baseless legal fight would be expensive enough to make me surrender or settle, giving her a last shred of victory. But she made the same mistake she'd always made, underestimating the community she tried to control and underestimating Trevor. His response was immediate and resolute. The new HOA leadership voted unanimously to fund legal support for any resident being targeted over actions that improved community safety. At an emergency meeting, Trevor made it clear, Rebecca Morrison used HOA money to attack people when she was in charge. He announced, "Now this community will use its resources to defend against her harassment." The message was unmistakable. The neighborhood had changed, and this time, it stood together. Rebecca's reign of intimidation ended as swiftly as it had fallen. The lawsuit collapsed faster than her old fence had burned. Trevor's video clearly showed the fire was accidental, and multiple neighbors testified about the workshop's educational value and my professional response when things went wrong. What truly doomed her case, though, was the revelation that her fence had violated multiple safety codes for years. She was suing someone for accidentally damaging her own illegal structure. The judge dismissed the case with prejudice, preventing her from ever refiling, and ordered her to pay my legal costs. During the hearings, more about Rebecca's past came to light. It turned out her lawsuit against the fire department wasn't her first clash with emergency services. She'd filed noise complaints against paramedics for using sirens late at night, sued a police officer for trespassing when he responded to a domestic violence call next door, and even demanded the city reroute ambulances so they wouldn't disturb her sleep. Rebecca wasn't just a controlling HOA president, she deeply resented anyone whose authority she couldn't bend to her will. The fence that replaced her fire hazard became a symbol of what the neighborhood had become. It was lower, friendlier, and built from fire-resistant materials that made everyone safer. The community voted to help pay for it, not because they owed Rebecca anything, but to show they could do the right thing together. It was an act of healing through cooperation instead of conflict. Rebecca's departure was as quiet as her rule had been loud. No farewell parties, no drama, just a moving truck that showed up one Saturday morning and was gone by the afternoon. I happened to be washing my truck when she loaded her final boxes. For a moment, our eyes met across the street. There was no final outburst or speech, just the silent acknowledgement that the fight was over, and she had lost. Then she drove away, leaving behind a community that was stronger for having endured her. The transformation of Maplewood Heights was remarkable. Without Rebecca's oppressive grip, residents found the freedom to express themselves. Lawns bloomed with colorful gardens instead of uniform shrubs. Children's chalk art brightened sidewalks. Families put up swings, fire pits, and decorations, knowing that if real issues arose, neighbors would resolve them with conversation rather than citations. My truck stayed parked right where it always had, but its role evolved. Parents brought their kids over for impromptu fire safety chats. The local school invited me to speak about emergency preparedness. Nearby neighborhoods reached out, hoping for their own workshops. What had started as a defense against harassment turned into something genuinely meaningful, community-based safety education that brought people together rather than tearing them apart. Trevor, once too shy to speak up, grew into his new leadership role with grace that surprised everyone, maybe even himself. One evening, he confided, "Watching you stand up to Rebecca taught me something. Leadership isn't about control. It's about service, making things better for everyone, not just for yourself." 6 months after Rebecca left, I got a letter that reminded me why it had all been worth it. It was from Emily, a teenager in the next town over. She'd heard about our workshops and wrote, "Our HOA president is just like the woman you dealt with. She's making life miserable for everyone, especially families with kids. We need someone to show us how to fight back the right way." Standing on my porch, reading Emily's words while my truck gleamed in the afternoon sun, I felt its spark of purpose again. Phoenix doesn't just rise from ashes, sometimes it flies to where it's needed most. Rebecca had tried to punish me, but instead, she helped me discover a new way to serve, by teaching communities how to protect themselves. Sometimes the best way to fight flames is to prevent them in the first place. I stepped inside and began drafting my reply to Emily. The truck would be ready when her neighborhood needed it. After all, fighting HOA tyranny was just another form of emergency response, and Phoenix was always ready to answer the call. The fire of justice burns wherever people refuse to back down, and there were surely other neighborhoods still trapped under fear and control, waiting to learn what Maplewood Heights had discovered, that communities become strongest when they choose fairness over fear, service over selfishness, and cooperation over control. Phoenix was ready to rise again. But who would need saving next? If this story fired you up, hit that like button. It helps others find these tales of poetic justice. And if you'd like to support my mission to share more stories like this, there's a link below. Until next time, remember, justice burns brightest when good people refuse to stay silent.